Ask not what we all be can do for you. Ask what you can do for we all be.
And that was Sister Sherry Lynn Johnson, the co-director of the Cornell University Law School's Death Penalty Project. She represented the defense, Curtis Flowers, in the recent oral argument before the Mississippi Supreme Court last month. And I am your host for this empowerment segment, Brother Ron, also known as R2C2H2, the artivist. And this is We All Be. We got a great show, a very interesting show, 2 hours full of not just edutainment, but also information that is important to folks being aware of what's going on around them, even in their own backyard. Stuff you might not get on the quote-unquote white stream media will be on We All Be from time to time. So please feel free to join in the conversation today. This is a very important conversation at area code 646-652-4593. That's area code 646-652-4593. And if you're scared to get on the air, we got the chat room open right now. And we'll also be doing some live tweeting throughout the program to let people know what's going on, because it's so important to take advantage of this social media phenomenon. Because a lot of things are happening right now we would not know about if it was not for social media, whether it be Eric Gardner getting killed by the NYPD in Staten Island, or whether it be what's going on in Israel with the Palestinians and the Israelis, or Jerusalem, whatever you want to call it. It's very important that people take the responsibility and have the accountability to report the news, because less than 1% of what you see on quote-unquote corporate news media or white stream media actually represents what's going on in the world. Whatever is happening to you right now as we speak is news. You should share it through your platforms, because never underestimate the power of one person to affect change or change the narrative. And without further ado, let's get into a discussion. This first hour topic discussion is an innocent man on death row, Curtis Flowers. Back in June of 2010, Curtis Flowers became the only person in U.S. judicial history to be tried 6 times in a capital murder trial on the same evidence. Now, people would say, yeah, there have been other cases of folks being tried 5 or even 8 times, I believe, for a crime. But never, this is a precedent now, this man has been tried 6 times in a capital murder case on the same evidence. No new evidence, nothing. This is the same evidence. It's like Groundhog Day, excuse me. So he's been tried 6 times on the same evidence. This is unprecedented. And now we're looking at the Mississippi Supreme Court to make a decision to overturn his last conviction, because before that, in those 6 trials, you had 2 hung juries, 3 mistrials. 3 overturned convictions by the Mississippi Supreme Court. So the Mississippi Supreme Court actually overturned 3 convictions prior to the 6th trial, which found him guilty, and now he's on death row. He's been there for almost 20 years. He's 44 years old now. So without further ado, I'd like to get to my guest. One guest is a truly unsung hero. He's an exceptional person. He is the founder and visionary behind the Friends of Justice movement, none other than Brother Reverend Alan Bean. How you doing today? Welcome back to We All Be.
Good to be on the program.
Man, it's an honor to have you on, man, because you really was a true unsung in this whole thing. I know I found out about the Curtis Flowers case through the work you have been doing with the Friends of Justice. I just want to get your input on it. I know, have you seen the oral argument? Have you seen all of it recently?
Yes. First, I was able to read the appeal in its entirety, and then was able to turn in. It wasn't a very good picture, but you were able to pretty much see what was going on in the courtroom as oral arguments were presented by Sherry Lynn Johnson.
And what are your thoughts about the way it proceeded?
Well, I got the same impression that I received when we were in the courtroom in 2010 for the last trial. It seemed to me that the prosecution, prosecutor Doug Evans, DA Doug Evans, had worked things so that there was a high degree of intimidation. I could tell just from listening to conversations that most of the African-American people who were prospective jurors, who were there in the veneer, and that they did not want to be on the jury. And the reason for that is that a fellow named James Bibbs, who was a retired school teacher who lived in Winona, had been accused of perjury shortly after he was the single juror in the fifth trial who refused to go along with the verdict. Mr. Bibbs has told me that the first time they took a poll, 3 jurors thought that he was not guilty. 2 of them were talked over to the other side. The deal was that if they dropped the death penalty, that one of the African-American people would come over, and then there was a white woman who also was not convinced by the evidence. But the 2 others went over to a guilty verdict, and Mr. Bibbs would not. He was accused of perjury, and eventually those charges were thrown out when Mr. Bibbs' attorney, Rob McDuff out of Jackson, was able to get those charges, well, get both the prosecutor and the judge recused from the case, and then it reverted to the Attorney General's office in Mississippi, and they looked at the charges and said, "This is ridiculous," and just dropped the charges. But that had a chilling effect on the jury, and so it wasn't as hard for Doug Evans, the prosecutor, to get a overwhelmingly white jury. He could have gotten an all-white jury if he had wanted to, simply because there were so many black jurors or black potential jurors who, when asked, are you against the death penalty, would say yes. Can you be objective in this case, would say no, and would in various other ways eliminate themselves. And so I think it's going to be much more difficult to make what they call a Batson challenge, that is, getting a racially unrepresentative jury on the basis of racial bias. You have to show that there's evidence of racial bias. I think the defense team did a good job of working the evidence as it exists, but I kind of got the impression, just listening to the Supreme Court justices in Jackson ask questions, that there are several white justices who really don't seem that eager to reverse this one on that basis. And I may have misread them, but that was the impression I got. The other impression I got was that when it came to grilling the state, when the state put on its arguments, the person leading the charge was the single African-American justice on the Mississippi Supreme Court. And so you had 2 or 3 white justices grilling the defense counsel who was presenting the oral argument for Mr. Flowers, and then you had the single African-American justice who was grilling the government and asking them questions. That didn't give me a very confident position, because you need to get 5 of these people to side with the defense in order to get a reversal. So we'll see what happens. There are a lot of issues, as Sherilyn Johnson mentioned in the lead-up comment. So we'll see what happens. But I was not overly encouraged by what I saw.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely there. I was there at the oral argument presentation a week or so ago, and I was actually surprised that Justice King, the black justice, did raise those questions, because I think the issue is, like, how can you prove racism or white supremacy in a system that talks about being fair or justice is blind? How can you prove, it's like if you have a discrimination case, it's hard to prove racism in a discrimination case. It's even harder now, probably any other time in recent history, to prove that. So the fact that he did raise those questions really, gave me some type of hope that they might help. It's hard to read the justices. It's like a poker game, because they all ask interesting questions and whatnot, but I can't really tell which way they was going to go or where they are going with this upcoming decision. But I was interested when I found out that the black jurors who were not allowed to serve because I guess they were too honest, it's like they were being punished for being too honest, that they actually asked more questions of the potential black jurors than they did of the potential white jurors. I'm talking about the prosecution, the DA. Like, for example, they said that they asked black jurors 10 questions versus some of the potential white jurors that asked only 1 or 2 questions. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, there's no doubt when you were in the courtroom in 2010 that Doug Evans was trying to get as few African-American people on the jury. It's not just a racial thing, because they did get a single black juror, but, he had black skin, but all his friends were white. He identifies with the white community. I think he was in a management position, so he was economically fairly well off. He lived in a neighborhood that's predominantly white. All his friends are predominantly white. He votes Republican, blah, blah, blah. And so he's not your typical black person. He had not been influenced by the word on the street. He didn't know anybody. He didn't identify with the black community. And so although his skin was black, he doesn't really qualify as a person of color. He thought pretty much like a white person and was influenced by the white community. And in Winona, public opinion on this case divides right down the line. It follows just like electoral politics. You can pretty much tell what a person thinks about the case by what part of town they live in and what color their skin is. And that's sad, but that is what the case is all about. And that's why it's so important for Doug Evans to always get lots of white people on the jury, because the white people in the courtroom in 2010 really wanted to get on the jury. And part of it's just the dynamics. And I've talked to people, Latino or African American, who were in the courtroom, and I said, did you want to be on the jury? And they'll always say, hell no.
Right.
I don't want to be in a room, the only person of color in a room with a bunch of white people who all agree and disagree with me. That's an uncomfortable social position, especially if you're a person of little social prominence. You don't have a lot of self-confidence. You're not used to being in highly charged situations. You're not used to standing up to a bunch of people who are different from you. You're not used to being in a room with nobody that looks like you. And everybody disagrees with you. That is an intimidating situation, especially for somebody who doesn't, have a lot of confidence in their ability to deal with that kind of a situation. And so, if you were dealing with a black professional, it might be a little different. But even there, nobody wants to be in that position. Doesn't matter how confident you are, how much life experience you've got, how much education you've got, how well-spoken you are, how well you can marshal arguments. You don't want to be in a room with where everybody disagrees with you. It's just painful. And so people will try to get out of that. On the other hand, because there is this overwhelming majority opinion in the community of Winona, in the white community, that Curtis is guilty, everybody wanted their chance to nail the guy. And so you get this weird division within the community that, unfortunately, it's not just this case that brings that out. You see it in terms of schooling patterns. Almost a lot of the white kids in the school, if they can afford to, go to what is called the Christian school, but it's really a segregation academy. There's not a single person or student of color or teacher or administrator that's anything other than white at that school. And so it's a very segregated community, as our communities unfortunately tend to be. And this case has really been hijacked by those social dynamics, that racial division. It really brings it out. And so Doug Evans, the DA, has used that division to his own advantage. And he has to, because the evidence, as Sherilyn Johnson pointed out in the piece that you used at the beginning of the program, the evidence in this case is really weak, incredibly weak. And so Evans really has to get an audience, a group of jurors who are primed to believe him. If he had 3 or 4 black jurors in Winona, there's no way he'd get a conviction under any circumstances, and he knows that. So he tried to stack the deck. Now the question is, how obvious did he have to be in order to make that happen? And I'm not sure. We'll just sort of see how the Supreme Court justices wrestle with this. I think one thing in Curtis's favor is that I think the Supreme Court has found on 3 previous occasions that Doug Evans was racially biased. And that brings up another question because, basically what the Supreme Court has said to Doug Evans on 3 different occasions is, sure, sir, in the way you picked that jury, you demonstrated racial bias. Here, go and do it again. We'll give you another shot at it. Well, if the guy is racially biased, he's racially biased. He's not going to get over it, He's not going to have a come-to-Jesus moment in between trials. If the guy has racial bias, he has racial bias. But the system can't admit that, can't deal with that kind of reality. And so he gets a second chance, he gets a third chance, and possibly will get a fourth chance. I think what this case needs, and the only way that Curtis will ever get any justice, is if Doug Evans is no longer able to prosecute the case. It is given to the state of Mississippi, and what I would love to see is all of these people who have testified against Curtis Flowers given an opportunity to recant their testimony without penalty, because they all know that if they back away, and they've been told that if they back away from their testimony that they originally gave, that they will be prosecuted for perjury and obstruction of justice and in due time. And obviously they don't want that. So they're going to continue to say what they have been saying over the last 20 years if nothing changes. And so they all need to be given an opportunity to back out if they're so inclined. And I think if they were given that opportunity, most of them would.
Well, I hope so. There's a couple of things on my mind that's very puzzling and very disturbing to me. Like you raised the issue of the lack of substantial, like all this stuff is circumstantial evidence. There's really no hard, concrete evidence connecting Curtis to the scene or the quadruple homicides. I even talked to the investigator, Max Mays, earlier about this, earlier in the week.
Right.
He said it's incredible that a person could be put on death row with such little evidence tying them to the crime, and he was not tried. Curtis Flowers was not tried by a jury of his peers, period. Like even you said in the last trial, the last black juror is so removed from the day-to-day reality of a Curtis Flowers. I mean, you're not even from the same income bracket, the guy who was on the jury of color had resources that Curtis Flowers never had. And had he had those resources, we might not be talking about Curtis Flowers today in this situation. I mean, you got a county, I believe, that's almost half and half black and white. And, Mississippi, I went to the
55% black, 55% white.
Okay, so you got Mississippi that brags about the fact that they got more elected black officials in the state and the union, how they came so far from Freedom Summer from the 60s and whatnot. But yet, you got cases like Curtis Flowers that kind of trump all of that, propaganda about them having so many black elected officials. So really, how can you have a 7 trial if it's based on the same evidence and unreliable testimony?
Yeah, that's right. I don't think you can have, and especially and this is something that didn't come up at the oral hearing in Jackson. But after the trial in 2010, which was the 6th time that Curtis went to trial on these charges, the state's star witness, Patricia Sullivan, or Patricia Odom, she goes by a variety of names, but currently I think it's Patricia Sullivan.
Okay.
It came to light that she was under federal indictment for income tax fraud. She was working as an income tax preparer. I believe she had her own company. And she was just making stuff up. I don't know if she was splitting the difference with the people she was working for or how exactly she benefited. But we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent claims that she was making, deductions that she was saying these people had deductions when they didn't. And she was eventually tried in federal court and found guilty. And the odd thing was that it wasn't Mr. Evans himself, but a person who used to work for Doug Evans as an associate or as an assistant DA was representing Patricia Sullivan in this case, and he told the judge, the federal judge, when she had been found guilty and they were doing sentencing, he asked for clemency because she had been so helpful in providing testimony for this case in Winona, Mississippi, not realizing, and people thought that was a credible request to make. Well, if this person has been making up lies in order to fill her own pockets or to line her own pockets for years as an income tax returner or preparer, then why would you think that she was telling the truth to the government? She obviously is not a person of honesty and integrity. She has a demonstrated track record of lying for her own benefit. And I think it goes back to the first trial, where after the first trial, her brother, who was incarcerated at Parchman Prison after the first trial with Curtis Flowers, wrote a letter to Lola Flowers in which he admitted that he and his sister Patricia had made the whole thing up because they wanted $30,000 of reward money. And that's another issue that needs to get a lot more attention, is that most of the people who are testifying were shown two things. They were shown a flyer advertising a $30,000 reward for anybody who would testify and get it toward, or whose testimony secured a conviction in this case, and then they were shown a picture of Curtis Flowers. The obvious message was, if you tell us that you saw Curtis at the time and place that we are suggesting to you, you'll get $30,000. And none of the people who took that deal, and it took months and months and months for them to find people willing to say that they had seen Curtis here and there. None of the people who took that deal have received one red cent. It was basically a lie. They were manipulated, and they have all got a reputation in the African-American community in Winona, all of these witnesses do, of being people who are kind of weak-willed and not reliable. Some of them are mentally unstable. One woman was taken to the courtroom to testify from a mental hospital. She's got a series of, a whole history of being mentally unstable. And so they did not get the brightest and the best. And people in the black community know who these people are, and they can evaluate the credibility of their testimony, and that's one of the reasons. People are not saying, we think Curtis might have done it, but he's black, so we're going to take his side in this. People don't think that way. This was a terrible crime, right. And everybody in town was horrified. One of the victims was African American. So everybody thinks this is a terrible crime, and whoever did it deserves to spend the rest of their life in prison. But the question is Curtis the guy? And that's a big question. And so when I talk about Patricia Sullivan and how critical she is to this case, and this is why I was a little disappointed that more of this didn't come up at oral arguments, but that's the nature of an appeal. It doesn't tend to hinge on the evidence so much as procedural problems. But Patricia Sullivan's testimony set the timeline, really created the template for the state's entire case. She said that she lived in a duplex, next door to Curtis and his girlfriend Connie. And that's true, she did. She lived on the other, they were both in the same building. And so she said that she saw him leave early in the morning, just when the police told her that he probably would have, just before the gun was taken from the Angelica Furniture Factory, garment factory, which is no longer in existence. The building's still there, but they don't use it as a factory anymore. That supposedly Curtis had walked over to the furniture factory, stolen the gun out of Doyle Simpson's glove compartment, and then walked back to his duplex, waited around for about an hour, and then headed over to Tardy Furniture, murdered 4 people, come back, and then went about his business as if nothing had happened. That is the story that Patricia told the police. And the reason she told them that story is because that's the story they asked her to tell them. And so she basically just corroborated what they said in exchange for $30,000. that is patently obvious. And then what happened was the inspectors walked those two routes to the to the garment factory and back, and to Tardy Furniture and back, and asked people along the route if they had seen Curtis come by at particular times and places. Did you see him on this morning of the murders at about like 9 o'clock or 8:45 or 7:30, depending on the situation? And they would say either yes or no. Sherry Lynn Johnson pointed out that every one of these people gave a completely different description of what Curtis was wearing. One woman had him wearing a sweater on a day when it was like 95 degrees early in the morning, and another woman had him running. Well, I've walked to and from, my wife and I were in Winona just about a month ago, and we walked over to Tardy Furniture and back, and we were dripping with sweat, and it was only 78 degrees, but it's so humid in Mississippi.
Right.
You know that. It's the same thing in Memphis, that nobody's going to be running on a much hotter day. It just doesn't make sense. They all had Curtis wearing totally different clothing. The color, there's absolutely no similarity. He's wearing shorts, he's wearing long pants, he's wearing T-shirts, he's wearing sweaters, he's wearing button-down shirts. You know, there's just no consistency, which is exactly what you would expect to hear if these people are just making it up. Now, if they really did see him, you'd still get some variation because people don't remember clearly, and they don't remember consistently. But there would be some overlap, you know, from one person to the next. You'd be able to trace some patterns. They'd remember maybe that he had a certain logo on his T-shirt or something of that sort. That would keep coming up, even though other details change. But there's absolutely no commonality between these witnesses. So it really is disturbing. And the deeper you get into this evidence, and that's one of the reasons that Max Mays is so disturbed about this case, is that, like me, he's gone over all the evidence with a fine-tooth comb, and you realize everybody's lying. That's the only explanation for all the facts.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy while I'm listening to you talking, and I'm saying, how unreliable is eyewitness testimony? I mean, it's crazy because even we know about Clark McMillan, Brother McMillan, who's been in jail. He was in jail for almost 30 years on eyewitness testimony,
right,
which was faulty. And eyewitness testimony has been proven not to be 100% effective. It's 50% effective. Because I was shown at the oral argument the actual lineup that they showed Porky Collins, who's deceased now, I believe his name was, that, you know, he said Curtis did it, but Porky also said it could have been 3 or 4. He didn't say, I'm sorry, I'm very like this. He saw 3 or 4 people in the lineup that matched that description of his eyewitness recollection. Oh, yeah. But the thing about it is, Reverend Bean, is the fact that if you look at the lineup that was shown to Collins, the largest picture on the page was Curtis Flowers. So what was that all about? Why is his picture so outsized versus everybody else's picture in the lineup?
Yeah, and that is a classic way that you can induce people to pick the right person. You make their face really big and everybody else of uniform size so that the eye naturally goes to, you know, it's sort of like the old Sesame Street thing. One of these things is not like the other.
Exactly.
People aren't, you know, our brains are wired for pattern recognition. And we naturally focus on the exception. That's why racial prejudice is such a it's one of the many reasons that racial prejudice is such a enduring and insidious thing, is because it's hot-wired into our minds to like people who sound like us, who look like us, who talk like us, who have the same kind of jobs, same kind of values, and to be suspicious of people who don't look like us. And that's one of the reasons why we have so much trouble with immigration policies. We really don't see people who don't look like us as fully human beings. That's one of the reasons we're having such a hard time getting United States politicians to identify at all with the people in Palestine, because they identify with the Israelis. They do not identify with the Palestinians for any variety of reasons. And so, you know, all of these things play into eyewitness identification, especially cross-racial witness identification. When a white person is saying, I saw this black person do something, or when a black person does it, testifies that they saw a white person doing something. Cross-racial identifications are really, really unreliable. And so this case, and I think Clark McMillan is a good example, but when they take all of the DNA exonerations that have happened across the country, particularly in Dallas County, you find that by far the biggest reason these people were convicted is because some credible, sympathetic witness was absolutely convinced that they saw them do it. And they were wrong. Time after time after time, they were wrong. The eyes deceive.
Right.
We think if we see something that means it's a fact. But, we don't remember things. We don't remember an actual photograph. Our minds are not photographic. Rather, every time we re-remember something, we fiddle with our memories. And so we can often, over time, convince ourselves that we saw something that we did not see. Porky Collins, in the case of Curtis Flowers, was desperate to, this is a nobody, a guy who's lived his entire life. He's in his 70s, heading for the last roundup, and he knows it, and he gets this opportunity, this 15 minutes of fame. This is a big case, 4 dead people, everybody's horrified, and he saw somebody in front of Tardy Furniture. So he comes forward. Now, I believe Porky did see a couple of guys in front of Tardy Furniture, but it wasn't Curtis Flowers. And one question they've never answered is, well, who was the other guy, and what happened to him? They never said that Curtis did this in cooperation with somebody else. And as you suggested when you were interviewing Miss Curtis's attorney, this is not a crime that could have been committed by one person.
No.
You can get one person coming into Tardy Furniture and killing 4 people with a gun. That's true. But you couldn't do it execution style. That is just not going to happen. People would have bolted. They would have tried to save their skin and been shot in the back. And
it's like Bobo Stewart, though. Like he's
smashed into furniture.
Bobo Stewart, he was a young guy. He was an in-shape, athletic guy, baseball player. And then you had the other guy who was a brother. I think he was middle age. But you had 4 people. They're not going to sit still, like you said. Yeah. You're not going to sit still and just get shot at without trying to move or fight for your life or flight.
No. But if you have, there is a parallel case, and this is kind of interesting, in Birmingham, Alabama, which is about, 200 miles, 180 miles due east of Winona on Highway 82, where there was this psychopathic young kid, 16 years old, who talked this 22-year-old into being his partner in crime. And they'd go to these various little stores, just nondescript little stores like Tardy Furniture, and hold people up. And they sort of progressed. And at first they were just holding them up. And we know exactly what they happened because a lot of these stores had video cameras that photographed the whole thing. And then they progressed to one situation where one guy held his gun on the proprietors, where the other person shot them. And one person was killed and another person was seriously injured. And so that is the kind of scenario we're looking at. 2 people, one person holds his gun on the victims, the other person does the shooting. That makes sense. And that's the only way you could control a room like this. So there's all of this evidence that has, and Max Mays agrees with me completely on that. And Max, by the way, before he became a private investigator, put cases together for the Hinds County DA. So he knows what a proper investigation is supposed to look like. And he told me, this is the worst investigation I've seen in my entire career.
Yeah, he did echo that with being. Anybody ever, it's like some spree killers, right? Did anybody ever interview these people? Have they ever been caught? The folks that you referenced?
Yes, they were. They were, but nobody has ever investigated them. And it's interesting that these killings happened within a month of the Tardy murders, and yet Doug Evans made no attempt to talk to the people in Birmingham and maybe just on the off chance, because it's only a 2 or 3 hour drive from Birmingham to Winona on a, and so, but no attempt was made to do that. And as you also indicated when you were talking to Ms. Johnson, nobody who was associated with any of the victims, nobody in their families was ever interviewed.
That's kind of unusual. Is that unusual?
Yeah, and the authorities don't like to ask those hard, penetrating questions about, was there any animosity in your family towards anybody? Because, these people have just lost a loved one under horrendous circumstances. They're still in shock. You don't want to trouble them, but you have to do it because it's part of the job. You have to know what happened. Why was Tom Tardy, who was Bertha's husband, and much older than her, and I think she was 59 and he was like 80. Why was he not in the store that day? He was in the store every day. Curtis told me that when he was dusting, Tom would be sitting there near the front, sort of saying hi to everybody as they came in, and Curtis used to pretend to dust around him, and they'd joke back and forth. But he wasn't there that morning. Why was he not there? What was the relationship between Bertha Tardy's biological children and the children from the previous marriage that Tom Tardy had? Because what people don't realize is that Bertha was not the original wife of Tom. Tom had a wife, and Bertha basically, there was a relationship between Tom and Bertha, and he divorced his first wife. Okay. And the children from that first marriage between Tom and his first wife never forgave Bertha. They did not appreciate what she had done. Now, that's still a pretty lame motivation for a crime of this nature. But you have to look at it anyway. And then there's a guy named Benny Rigby. He was estranged from Carmen Rigby, one of the victims. She was the financial manager in the store. Benny is a troubled soul. He just about punched me in the face when we were at the trial there. He kept getting up in my face. He was just absolutely vile. And I talked to people who tell me that he has threatened them physically and threatened to kill them. Here's a hothead. He is capable, not necessarily of doing it himself, but of paying somebody to kill somebody. And I think probably the two most likely scenarios in this case are A, that it was sort of like what happened in Birmingham, just a couple of psychopaths wandering in off the streets who kind of enjoy doing this sort of thing just intrinsically. Or it was a hired hit that one person had hired somebody to do, and it went wrong. They thought they had the person alone in the store and realized there were other people who were potential witnesses and had to kill them too. One way or the other, it involved two people, and that's why I think it's significant that Porky Collins saw two people out in front of the store at a time when, if you follow the chronology of the crime, probably the killing had already been done. And yet, so I've always wondered if people wandered into the store, because this was, the lights were on, it was business hours, the store opened at 9 o'clock. It would have been very easy for somebody to walk into the store, realize that they had stumbled upon a horrible murder, and if they were a person of color and male, they would have said, oh God, they're going to pin this on me, and head out the door, having first stepped in the blood. That could have happened very easily, and it would be a perfect example or explanation for the shoot. But as Sherry Lynn Johnson mentioned, Sam Jones, this elderly guy in his 80s who Bertha Tardy used to sort of train up the new hires and sort of show them the ropes, he had come over that morning, and he swears that footprint was not there when he left the store to make the phone call, but that it was when he came back in. So, that footprint evidence is very weak.
It make you think about it, too. I mean, is Tom Tardy, is he deceased now or he's still living?
No, he's I'm sure he must be deceased now. I think he probably didn't live that much longer after, and he was kind of spirited away, but of course all of these you hear all of these theories in the black community in Winona, and it's hard to know what to believe. And the reason it's hard to know what to believe, and the reason that Sherry Lynn Johnson said that there's nothing in the record to indicate that family members were involved, is because nobody was ever asked the questions. We are not, as private citizens, in a position, and I'm certainly not going to do it, to walk up to these people. I have no...
you did it close enough, Reverend B. I would got punched out in the face. I understand your
That's right. They're not going to talk to me. The only person who has the standing to do that is Doug Evans, and he didn't do it. And because he didn't do it, all kinds of rumors are floating around, some of which are probably totally inaccurate. But that's what happens when the authorities don't do the job that they have been given by the state.
Well, Reverend Bean, what troubled me the most is the fact that if what Sam Jones said is true, that the shoe print only appeared once he came back. To me, that's all the hallmarks of a professional hit. That's a professional hit. The people who did that knew what they were doing. They weren't no hotheads. They were cool, calm professionals. Although they psychotic, they were cool and calm professionals. They knew exactly what they were doing. They left no fingerprints. Okay, so and then the fact that you got a guy in death row on this circumstantial evidence with no fingerprints tying him to the scene of the crime. He did not own a pair of the shoes that made the shoe print at the scene of the crime. He's not even own the weapon that was supposedly used on the victims. So how the hell can you connect him to this case? This is a total. It's like Doug Evans, almost like Captain Ahab in Moby Dick. Just obsessed.
Right.
Like
it
total
was clear to me, and I didn't pick this up until the trial was over in 2010. But it was clear to me, just from listening to the various witnesses testify, and they were grilled a lot harder than they had been in some of the other trials, that Curtis Flowers was the only person of interest in this case by noon, the day of the murder. That is, within 2 hours of Doug Evans arriving at the store to begin the investigation, Curtis was the only person they were looking at. They had pretty much written off Doyle Simpson, who was supposedly the owner of the gun. At least he says that his gun was stolen from his glove compartment. They had pretty much eliminated him as a witness. They did not do a gunshot residue test on him. They did not take his fingerprints. They brought him in, talked to him a few minutes, and let him go. And I think the reason was that I think Doug Evans realized that this was the kind of case. You got 4 innocent people dead in this community of Winona. It's the worst crime that town had ever seen, that whole region had ever seen, at least the worst homicide. And the question is, are you going to get reelected as DA if you don't find a perpetrator? And I think Evans realized that the only person that he could probably build a case around was Curtis Flowers, because he had worked there. He had this half-assed motive. Supposedly, he comes, he works for 3 days, he doesn't tie down some batteries for golf cart batteries that he was supposed to have on a truck. He didn't tie them down, they fell off, some of them were broken, and Bertha told him that she was going to have to take, because of his negligence, she was going to have to take the cost of those batteries, which was well over $100, out of his salary. Mm-hmm. Which meant that if he continued to work for her, he'd be working for free for several days. And it's a minimum wage job. He didn't really like it. He he's an outdoors kind of guy, as is Archie, his father. And he had pretty much decided he didn't want to go back. So then she gives him Bertha Tardy, his boss, gives him a $30 advance nonetheless, and tells him to enjoy the 4th of July. He doesn't come back. Now, we're talking about a kid. Curtis Flowers now is a grown man. He would never do that. But he was a kid at this time. He was in his early 20s. Right. Every time he got a job, the factory would close or something would happen. And it's really, as you suggested earlier, one of the reasons that Curtis was vulnerable was because he was unemployed. He was home alone. He couldn't furnish a knock him dead, drag him out alibi, and so he becomes the person they're going to put it on. And the reason for that is that Ms. Ballard, Bertha Tardy's daughter, comes down from Grenada. She's flustered. She's in shock. She loves her mother, and she was very close to Bertha, and she's dead, and she wanders into her mother's office, and she finds this check made out to Curtis Flowers, because Bertha had changed her mind. She was going to pay him his back wages. And Ms. Ballard looks at this, Roxanne, and she says, "This is the guy. He did it." And she had never met Curtis Flowers, didn't know him from Adam, and yet she gets this idea. And I think Doug Evans said, "Okay, she is by far the most forceful, dominant personality among all the family members. If I can get her to go along with this, the rest of them will follow." And I think that's why it all happened the way it happened. And then they just built the evidence. They invented evidence, created it out of thin air, and built a case around Curtis.
Now, well, we could talk about this for a long time, but I just want to raise some points. It's interesting you talking about Mrs. Ballard. The fact that I know Mrs. Flowers even mentioned on this show that when they had the trial in Gulfport, that Miss Ballard made a confession that she said that she don't feel like Curtis actually committed the crime, but somebody must be punished. In so many words, somebody must take the fall for this horrendous crime. And also, it was interesting in the oral argument to hear the prosecution bring up the fact that they had the postal theory, like he went postal like a postal worker, shooting it out in his place of employment. But here's the thing: Curtis Flowers he's been in jail for almost 20 years. He don't have any type of behavioral problems in jail. No behavioral misconduct in jail.
Write-up, disciplinarian write-up.
So how is that possible? He never killed it.
Prisons.
Right.
Yeah, that's almost unheard of, that a person would go that long without having a disciplinary write-up. At least a person who is accused of a crime of violence.
Quadruple homicide. He could be a stone-cold killer. Yeah.
Right. And I think that is the killer or the kicker for people who actually know Curtis. I've had the pleasure of talking to Curtis, both through plexiglass and also face-to-face, and once in Greenwood and then also in Parchman Prison where he is now. And when you meet the guy, he is, if you had to think of one phrase to describe him, it would be gospel singer. That's his passion. He loves singing gospel music. He was part of his father's gospel quartet. He was good at it. And he still does that. That's how he stays sane. How the guy stays sane, spending all this time in solitary confinement, I have no idea. But I just got a letter from him yesterday. It's a sweet guy, and he is just simply, if there's a person on the face of this earth who doesn't fit the profile of a serial killer or of a mass murderer, it's Curtis Flowers. And that is why the people who know him best say, Curtis could not have done that. This just does not fit who he was and who he is.
Well, I want to thank you, Reverend Bean, for that as well. I had a chance to meet his family, and I always thought I was doing a double take. I thought Curtis Flowers' brother was him. And I said, man, it could have easily been you or your brother, and your brother could have been here trying to defend you. I mean, it's like, it's crazy. But I want to thank you for all the unsung work you have done. That's why we gave you the 2010 We All Be Artivist of the Year award. It's very much an honor to give you an award, but you deserve so much more for what you have done, being an unsung advocate for justice. And I just wanted you to share with the people, how can we get in touch with you and connect with you and support you?
Okay. My website is friendsofjustice.net, friendsofjustice.net. I blog there, and also all my contact information is there. You can find my email address and my phone number, get in touch with me that way. If you'd like to donate to our work, just like you, we've got a PayPal account. You can just hit the little donate button, and that's quick and simple. And we need all the assistance we can get. So, people who do the kind of work that you and I do, we are dependent upon the kindness of strangers.
Yeah, definitely.
So, we're always grateful for anybody who can help us, because there is no money in this work, and that is always I think one of the reasons that so few people do it is that those who try get starved out and just sort of give up. It's very difficult to persevere, and so anybody who's out there who can support either this program or the work we do with Friends of Justice, we really appreciate it, and thank you very much in advance.
Well, Reverend Bean, we're glad that you planted that seed. We're glad for the work that you do and the work of the great late Duke Ellington. We love you madly. And you definitely will be back on. We'll definitely see what we can do to help you all out at Friends of Justice, raise that much needed and deserved cash flow.
It's great to be with you today.
Yes, sir. It's a great day. Thank you so much.